Hello, everyone. Today, I want to cover what I believe to be the most important lesson you can learn in a history class, maybe even in college, and is the Bill of Rights. Okay, so the reason I believe the Bill of Rights to be the most important lesson to learn in college is because this is something that is going to be useful in your everyday life, right? So everything else that we learn in a history class, it can vary from being, very interesting to being very practical to know, to understand the world around you, you know, valuable for different reasons. But the Bill of Rights is something that whether you see it or not, you're gonna understand the world around you and you interact with it, whether you see it or not, every day of your life, right? So once you learn the idea of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you start seeing and noticing, how the government works, how the laws work, in general. I believe this to be the most important lesson to learn in college, right? So let's get started. So first of all, the Bill of Rights is part of the Constitution. I always find it very interesting that whenever I ask people about the Constitution, they confuse it with the Bill of Rights. Okay, so the Bill of Rights is a separate document. The U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights together they make up the entirety of the Constitution, but they're two different documents, right? So, first things first. What is the Constitution? The Constitution is a framework, right, of how the country works, right, how the government works, right. So you can call it an owner's manual on the government. Here's where you can see, the branches of government, the authority of the president, the powers of Congress, the powers of the Supreme Court, all these intricacies of how the government is run. You can see it in the Constitution. However, one of the things that you do not find in the Constitution is the rights of the people, right? And that is the addition that the Constitution has, these amendments, that happen 4 years later that make up the Bill of Rights. And the reality is that I believe that most people do not understand the Bill of Rights correctly, right? I think that most people have an incorrect understanding of what are they and how they work, right? Most people think of the Bill of Rights as rights because it makes sense, right? That they're rights, right? However, you need to think of the Bill of Rights more as protections against an oppressive government. And once you understand them as protections against an oppressive government, you start seeing them in a new light, right? They start making way more sense, all right? Because you need to understand this, right? When the Bill of Rights were written, the founding fathers were very, I always call it paranoid, all right? But it made sense, all right? They're not paranoid. They lived through tyranny. They lived through oppression. So when they started their new form of government, they wanted to make sure that this will never happen again, right? So they created this system of government and they basically gave it the power to do things. However, they reserved some rights, they reserved some privileges that the government cannot touch, right? Like your freedom of speech, right? You're not going to make laws that prohibits the way I talk, all right? I will be able to criticize the government, all right? That was the purpose of the freedom of speech, that we're able to speak freely without the fear of the government telling us and censoring us, basically, right? So, now when you think of your Bill of Rights, about all these first 10 amendments, they make more sense, right? Because they are protections, right? They're not just rights because it's something that we like, right? We're protecting ourselves against the government. Okay, so I always remember when I was in middle school and I would ask my middle school teachers, right, like, why do I have freedom of speech? But I always thought about it as, why does the government gives us a freedom of speech? Why does the government gives me a freedom of religion, right? So this is asking an incorrect question, right? But my teacher never corrected me, right? My teachers would always tell me, well, because it's very nice. It's nice to have freedom of speech, isn't it? It's nice to have freedom of religion, isn't it? And it is nice, right? But this is not the reason why we have these things, right? The government doesn't give us these things, right? We reserve these powers, right? We have these powers, we have these rights to speak freely because we want to guarantee the government will not become oppressive, right? In other words, we created the government and gave it all this power, and we put faith that the government is going to do everything on the best interest of the people. However, just in case, we want to guarantee that they're not going to touch these things, they're not going to be able to infringe on this freedom, right? So this is the best way to understand your Bill of Rights. They're protections, right? They reflect that we always were very concerned about the government, right? And if you read the Federalist Paper number 51 by James Madison, you see this very famous phrase, right? If men were angels, we wouldn't need a government, right? So it basically gives us this idea of we need to make sure that whatever happens, we're always going to be able to speak freely, right? To criticize the government. We're always going to need our guns in case the government goes crazy, right? We're always going to need, you know, our right to privacy that we see in the Fourth Amendment, right? We're always going to need a due process. We don't want to have a government that interferes in those freedoms, right? So they make much more sense of protections than as freedoms. And so you can think of the Bill of Rights as a zero sum game, right? So a zero sum game is basically a scenario in which, in order for me to win something, you have to lose something, right? It basically comes from you, right? So I guess if I want to give you an example, just think about splitting a piece of pizza in two, right? If I get 60% of the pizza, that means you're going to get less. You're going to get 40, right? Me getting a little bit more means that you're gonna get a little bit less, right? So that's what the Bill of Rights are, right? It's a zero sum game. In order for me to have more rights, the government needs to lose those rights, right? In order for the government to have more power, it means that we, the people, have to lose some power, right? So the best way to understand it is like this, all right? So we always want to have, as the people, more power, right? We having more power means the government will have less power, right? But this gives you an idea of how much the founding fathers distrusted, putting too much power in the hands of the government, right? That they wanted to have a Bill of Rights, right? They wanted to make sure that in order for the people to have power, we needed to strip the government from that power, because unchecked power will lead to tyranny. And we want to make sure that we reserve this power so this will never happen, right? And if you want to think about it like this, Amendment 1 through 4 are basically, the rights of the people, right? It's basically when things are going right, when things are okay, what are your rights? What are your protections against the government? Amendment 5 to 8 are more about when you're in trouble, right? They are the rights of the accused, right? So basically, the government thinks you did something. So can they just throw you in jail, or can they just arrest you? And the answer is no, right? Because we wanted to make sure we have protection, right? So, and then Amendment 9 and 10 basically talk about the rights of the states and the rights of the people, right? So they are, again, protections against an oppressive government. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense. Once again, this is why it's such a valuable lesson to understand your rights, as I don't want the government to go crazy. So these are my rights. These are my protections against a crazy government. And so once again, this is why I believe the Bill of Rights to be the most important lesson, because understanding your rights, it's going to help you navigate around your everyday life better, right? You're gonna know way more about how the government works, and you interact whether you see it or not. You interact with the government every day, right? And one of the ways that I like to think about this is that imagine if we didn't have a Bill of Rights, that we only had the Constitution but no Bill of Rights. If we didn't have the Bill of Rights, but imagine that we could have the possibility of purchasing these rights. In other words, if in order to have a freedom of speech, you have to pay, $100 or however much you wanted to. Trust me, you would pay that. You would want to pay, you know what, let me pay money so I can be able to criticize the government. Let me pay money so I can have a fair trial. Let me pay money so I can have a right to privacy. Let me pay money so I can have, whatever religion I want to, and be sure that the people in government are not interfering, with the religion or vice versa, right? So This is my best explanation as to why they're so important. Trust me, if they were for sale, we would buy them, but they're free, right? They were enshrined in the Constitution, you know, in a way that we always have them. It is very important for us to understand what are your rights as a person in this country, right? So a lot of people walk through life without knowing these things or without giving it a second thought. But trust me, this is very important, right? This is very, very significant. I believe that we always tend to, get too comfortable, right? And I think our life is way too good today compared to how it was in the past, that we don't appreciate how important and, how much of a change in our life these rights mean. Okay, so I think generation after generation after generation, we get too comfortable. We forget how significant this is. We forget how much our life would be different without them, and we tend to not even give it a second thought, right? And you even hear some people wanting to get rid of some of these things or change them, like censorship or some of these things, you know, you know, with the Bill of Rights, because they don't appreciate how significant this is, right? Because we have not lived through tyranny, right? So this is very significant, and I believe this is one of the most important lessons, or actually the most important lesson, right? One of the things that I always tell my students is, I'm gonna be very proud of you if you know Washington and Lincoln and all the different things, but I'll be even more proud if you know your rights. I'll be even more proud if you understand the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, because that's where you're gonna use in your everyday life, right? So, anyways, guys, I don't want to take too much of your time. This is my quick explanation as to why the Bill of Rights is the most important lesson. But let me know what you think. Actually, tell me, how much do you think this rights would cost if you could purchase them? What value would you put on them, right? I believe they would be extremely, extremely valuable in the thousands of dollars. But let me know what you think. I'll be around and see you guys. Okay.